This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
Good evening, everyone. Apologies for starting late. We have a small technical difficulty which we fixed now. So Dr. Clarke is coming on soon. Please share the new link for the spaces on your timeline, in your communities, in your groups, across your social media. Okay, Dr. Clarke is here. Again, if you have any additional questions, please comment your questions in the lower. There's a comment icon in the lower right hand corner. You can comment your questions there. Hi, good evening, Dr. Clarke. Not hearing you, Dr. Clarke. Just a thumbs up for anyone in the audience that's hearing me clearly. Okay, thanks, Renee. Is anyone hearing Dr. Clarke? You can just wave your hand if not. Okay, let's try this again. So welcome again, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're trying to get Dr. Clarke back again. Okay, great. Dr. Clarke, you're here now. Are you hearing me? Okay, until then, let's just give Dr. Clarke 2 more minutes to just sign off and sign back again. Until then, remember, share your questions, read the SSL situation in the comment section. I see a few questions coming in already. Share this new link in your communities, your groups across your social media. We intend to have good conversation. There have been a few, misconceptions about the information that has been shared as it pertains to SSL, and Dr. Clarke wants to have the opportunity to uh, update the information that's there, so provide additional information and also provide some clarity around what is there now. So welcome. I see the media coming in. I see the finance Twitter community, a few CEOs, a few journalists. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Simon.
Yes, I'm hearing you now, Dr. Clarke. Great. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you
So,
to you for agreeing to co host and for all those who have joined on such short notice. We sent the notice out at about 6:15 or 6:20, and I'm happy to see that persons have made time on a busy Friday evening to join.
yes, absolutely. So, Dr. Clarke, just to kind of get, right into it, there's been a lot of information shared about SSL and where the investigation is, and a lot of speculation and questions around that. The first question I'd like to ask is, if you could just provide a general update on where the SSL investigation itself is.
All right, thank you, Simon. I can't provide an update that's better than the one provided by FID with respect to the details of the investigation. That the investigation has broadened the scope of the alleged fraudulent activities is wider than first thought. More accounts have been affected, approximately 70 accounts, up from 40, and more than sort of one fraudulent scheme seems to be at work, according to the investigators. Uh, the Kroll associates, who I would have updated the public that we had engaged earlier this year, are deeply involved, and have made trips to Jamaica, spending intense periods each time. They were here last week, and they would have provided me with an update that is similar to the update that the FID provided to the country this week. On Thursday, employees of SSL stayed home from work in protest against the delay in payment of salaries for August. And I, in my capacity as Minister of Finance, have to respond to situations such as that, and the guiding principles behind that response will be and is the policy position that I have outlined. And the policy position is to pursue this investigation and to follow the evidence wherever it leads, to leave no stone unturned, and to get international help. And I have said in the past that the government will provide whatever resources are required by investigators and others to see this investigation through. Now, the investigation is at a stage where the investigators have made it very clear to me in no uncertain terms that having the employees in place is critical to the progress of the investigation. I have faith and confidence in our investigators, and consistent with the policy direction and policy commitment, with that advice and request of our investigators, I announce that the government will provide the support. And by the government here, I mean non-specific, whether it's the central government or it's the FSC itself, will provide the resources on a temporary basis to support the payment of the salaries to employees and other operating costs of SSL to facilitate the fulfillment of the policy objective. Just to be clear, if I made another decision, such as we are not going to support the salaries and operating expenses, then the investigation would be compromised. Not that there'd be no prosecution. We already have Gene Panton arrested, but the enlarging of the investigation, bringing more persons into the net, so to speak, that would be stymied if I made a decision not to support the payment of salaries to SSL. And that is not in the public's interest. Interests can collide from time to time. And indeed, the public has an interest in not exposing itself financially or fiscally to this situation. Indeed, that's a legitimate interest. But I have to weigh that legitimate interest against another legitimate interest, which is against a background of 30 years of impunity with respect to financial sector fraud. Am I going to allow a temporary support, which could be in the order of 14, 15 million, it could be a little more per month over a short period of time, to stymie that overall objective for a country that is crying out for accountability in matters such as this? Faced with both interests, the superior interest has got to prevail. And that is the decision I've made. Unfortunately, I've seen over the last few hours where this has been presented in a way by, and probably inadvertently, by one media house nationwide that did not include pertinent aspects of the interview I gave this morning, and did not mention in their opening sort of paragraphs the purpose of the support, and would leave it to, well, at least there have been a couple of stories, but I'm talking about like the Instagram post and others, and to leave it to people's imaginations as to why the support is being provided. The single and sole motivation of this temporary support is to facilitate what has not happened in Jamaica over 30 years, which is a transparent, complete, unfettered, and thorough investigation into this matter. And I hope that through the forum this evening, where we have an opportunity to ventilate these issues, the audience here this evening will understand the objective and the choices that have been made at this juncture.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. A few questions on the back of that. So you mentioned that you haven't identified whether it's the central government that will be paying the monthly costs of SSL or the FSC. Can you make that identification now?
Yes. So,
Can
so
you?
what we're
Yeah.
the FSC has reserves that are substantially more than what is required here. We just have to make the checks to see whether we can use the reserves for this purpose. But it's more than likely that the FSC will be providing the support. But I need to, that has to be confirmed and verified.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. You also mentioned that the investigation or the payment of costs at SSL would go on for a short period of time. Do you have any idea of how long, of what exactly is a short period
Well,
of
I,
time?
I,
How
I
many
think
months?
I may have used the word temporary, a temporary period of time, meaning that it's not permanent. The extent of the time required, I'm not able to say, but it's not, I don't believe, this is not going to be indefinite. I want to allow me, there's a lot that I want to share. Allow me to explain that,
Sure.
remember that SSL still has client funds. These are funds that do not belong to SSL. indeed, the alleged fraud is that some people believe that client funds belong to them. But the client funds are no less owing to Gene Panton. Well, let me not use that analogy. The client funds belong to the clients and the clients only. SSL has custody of $30 billion approximately of client funds. Those funds have not been returned to those clients as yet, much to the frustration of some of those clients. One of the reasons why those funds haven't been returned, again, is to facilitate the investigation and to determine the full extent of the fraudulent activities or alleged fraudulent activities at SSL. Had those client funds been returned or the accounts been turned over to another institution or otherwise, it is quite possible that the full extent that we are now aware of, or that the investigators are now aware of, would not have surfaced. Over the last few months, one of the activities that SSL, the temporary manager, has been engaged in is verifying account balances with clients. So the general ledger has a particular account balance for a client. The client has his or her own statement that it has received from SSL. An important part of this process has been to reconcile that reported balance to the client with what is on the general ledger of SSL. We're talking about several hundred clients, possibly more. That's a process that's tedious, that takes time, and that requires individuals, human beings, to be engaged in. Where discrepancies are found between what's on the general ledger as owing to the client and what the client has received in statements, then those discrepancies have to be investigated. And it's the investigation of irregularities like that, and among other, that explain the expansion in the number of affected accounts by nearly 75%. So the employees having been there over the past few months it's not as if it's been for no gain. The investigators are now reporting affected accounts that are 75% higher than initially reported. Had we brought the curtains down, as some stakeholders of SSL would have wanted us to do, it is highly likely that the losses would have been there, but that the investigators would not have expanded their investigation by 75%, measured in terms of the number of accounts. Now, there will come a time, hopefully relatively soon, where the client money held by SSL will be returned to the clients. And that will be a good day, because clients of SSL, which include institutions, individuals, elderly persons, even the institutions owned by the government of Jamaica, have not had access to their funds held in custody by SSL over the past several months. We anticipate, as I mentioned, that, and when this occurs, there will be an update and a public announcement on it. But we anticipate that clients will soon, and I leave it with no more clarity than that, have access to their funds. Now, at that stage, you can imagine that the requirements at SSL will be different. Okay? But until such time, we have to make sure that those accounts are properly maintained, and you need staff to do that. And you need staff to maintain other things that are important to the investigation. I don't want to say too much about that, but
Mm.
I would ask for your reasonable understanding. If we're interested in getting to the bottom of it, this is a choice that we have to make. It does not represent a support of the shareholders of SSL. It does not represent a bailout of SSL. For there to be a bailout, there has to be a beneficiary. There's no SSL shareholder who is benefiting from the government support of the employees. There is no SSL client who is benefiting from the support of the employees. This is completely in the public interest of ensuring that the investigation is thorough and complete.
Thanks, Dr. Clark. So the FID stated that the investigation has now broadened to include more accounts, as you mentioned. Is it typical for when the investigation is not yet complete for employees to be retained, even though we're not sure whether they are involved?
Well, remember, let's separate things. We have a temporary man. You have a legal entity. The legal entity is in the securities business. The FSC found grounds to install a temporary manager to assume the operations of the legal entity. The investigative authorities subsequently launched a criminal investigation into alleged fraud at this entity. I can't speak to you about what is customary. I'm not a sort of investigator. This is not my line of work. I can't speak to you. But what I can speak to you about is that we've never had a successful and thorough and complete investigation into financial sector fraud of this magnitude over the past 30 years. That's what I can tell you definitively. And the investigators, the FID, Kroll Associates, have represented to me that they need to have employees in place to facilitate the investigations at this stage. And in addition, the maintenance of the client funds that SSL still has custody of have to be done by employees. You couldn't have, we couldn't send the temporary manager in alone, have him alone maintain $30 billion of client funds. Right? The client funds have to be maintained. Those client funds are invested in GOJ securities, invested in stocks, invested in, you have dividends coming in, you have, these
Okay.
are live investment accounts.
So,
And
so for clarity, Dr. Clark, the accounts are still accruing interest and whatever gains or unrealized gains or losses that they're making. They're still
yes,
invested. Okay.
yes, yes. So you have, these are live client accounts. And once you have $30 billion of live client accounts belonging to several hundred people, so I want you to get it, I want to get the sequence right. It's not that we need, it's not, while we need to rely on employees for the investigation, the sequence doesn't really begin that way. The sequence begins that there's $30 billion of client funds. We got a report that $3 billion was missing. Wait, let us ring fence this thing. Let's see the full extent of this fraud. Because we know that in situations like that, what meets the eye at first may only be a part of the story. So that's the first thing. It's like a police, going into a crime scene and putting a yellow tape around, freezing the scene. That's in this financial fraud matter, the equivalent, and the analogy is not perfect, but the equivalent of putting the yellow tape around is investigators saying the client funds need to remain until we finish our investigation or we get to a certain point in our investigation to dimension the full extent of this fraud. Now, once you make a determination that the client funds have to remain, then a consequence that flows from that is that you need people to maintain those client funds, to do the reconciliation, to be in touch with customers, to clients to respond to their queries, from a customer service point of view. That becomes a full consequence of the investigative decision to put the yellow tape around SSL. Okay, so that's a sequence. Now, it so happens that from January until now, SSL has been able to get by with income that it has been able to generate on its own. 8 months, or what is it now, September, is that 9 months
Yeah,
in?
eight
I
full
mean, that's
months.
quite a long time to go for an entity that is in this, in this stage, which you would, I don't want to use legal terms, but let us say that it's in a compromised financial state in terms of its own cash flow generating abilities. And that it has been able to be sustained on its own accord or own account for the past 9 months. But it's gotten to a stage now where it can no longer generate the income that is required to support the expenses. And that is why we are here at this point. But I want you to understand how this originates. It originates with putting the yellow tape around the crime scene and saying, look, those client funds need to stay
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
in the custody of SSL until we, the investigators, have dimensioned the extent of this fraud. And remember, my fellow Jamaicans, this is an alleged fraud that has been a long time in the making. Trying to piece together 10 years of activity is not a trivial exercise. Many roadblocks, many challenges, and this cannot be accomplished without having persons who know their way around the entity.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. Is the government also covering legal fees for SSL?
So the short answer to that is the operating expenses of SSL includes legal fees. I want you to understand the main sort of component of that. It's no secret that there is a matter in court where the former directors of SSL had applied for a voluntary winding up of SSL and sought to appoint a trustee, their own trustee, that would steward that winding up process. The FSC maintains that this is after, and I don't want to get too much into the legal case, it's a matter before the court, but there is a contention. The FSC appointed a temporary manager, and the FSC's desire and the government's desire is for that temporary manager to oversee SSL into the next stage. The former directors of SSL are maintaining that what they instigated should prevail, and not so much them. The trustee who was appointed by them is maintaining that his appointment is valid. Now, I want you to understand what is at stake. If that court case is lost by the FSC, then it could mean that the access that the FSC has through the temporary manager could become a little harder. Let's be euphemistic and put it that way. So the government stepping in to support the temporary manager / SSL in paying operating expenses inclusive of legal fees is critically important. That's a case that's next before the court later this year. The good news is that by then, I think it would have been 10 months, and by then, or 11 months, and by then, the investigators would have made substantial progress. But even then, it's important that the government, through the FSC and by extension its temporary manager, is able to put the best case forward for the best case forward that can support its view, and that its view prevails in the courts.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. We're a little about halfway through. I'm just trying to get some questions in that we have in the comments as well as in our communities as well. So, given that the government and by extension the taxpayers are currently paying for some of the operating expenses of SSL over what you've described as a temporary period to be determined, um, subject to where the case comes out, will the taxpayers be refunded for those amounts from SSL's from whatever funds are recovered from SSL?
Thank you
Or
for asking the question. One aspect of the reporting that has been absent, and certainly the reporting on the interview I gave on radio this morning, let me be very specific. An aspect that has been absent is on radio this morning. I said very clearly that the governments, and by government I mean whether it's the central government or FSC, the government's support of SSL in the payment of employee costs and direct expenses is conditioned on the FSC and the temporary manager using all legal means available to pursue the monetization of any asset on the balance sheet of SSL, inclusive of any accounts receivables. It will not be sufficient. The government will not accept a simple statement that accounts receivable balances are uncollectible. Under these circumstances of the government providing support, the government of Jamaica and the people of Jamaica will accept nothing less than a court order, either in Jamaica or in whichever territory is the registered territory of any legal entity that owes money to SSL. Only a court in that jurisdiction pronouncing that entity as insolvent will suffice as suffice for us to conclude that those amounts are irrecoverable. I said that very clearly, and unfortunately, that was not carried. Now, just to explain, remember that you have SSL, the legal company, the legal entity, and you have the off-balance sheet assets that belong to clients. Okay, the client funds are not held on the balance sheet of SSL. The client funds are held separately and belong to clients. They are not available to anyone apart from the clients of SSL. The balance sheet of SSL has assets and it has liabilities. And what I'm saying is that any asset, any and all assets on the balance sheet, apart, of course, from furniture and computers and intangibles like a computer system and things that are necessary for the ongoing responsibilities of SSL, that the temporary manager ought to seek a monetization of those assets. If that is successful and can yield funds, then those funds would become available for SSL to meet its creditor liabilities. Now, SSL is not in a formal bankruptcy proceeding, so I don't want to sort of go ahead, but one can't assume that, you know, the first use of funds that SSL comes into would be to repay the government. The schedule and the priority of liabilities, I don't want to pronounce on that. What I do know is that we have a choice at this juncture to do something that hasn't been done before, to change the narrative of this country with respect to financial sector fraud. Do we let it pass because we are we fume at the possibility of providing expenditure support to SSL for the investigation to continue? Or do we recognize that this is not desirable, but in the aid of a larger goal, provide the support? I probably have taken a long time to answer. I've been, on second thoughts, the way I would have answered in the first, is different from having thought about it. This is a complex legal situation. The next stage, would be obviously an insolvency proceedings for this entity. And in insolvency proceedings, the priority of liabilities, that's a dense legal matter, and I wouldn't want to pronounce on where the government would fall in that schedule.
Understood, Dr. Clarke. But from my understanding, effectively, you're saying to the extent of the law and to where this investigation ends, the authorities involved will do everything in their power to either sell assets, recover receivables, and funds to pay not just the clients who the funds are owed to, but to cover expenses that are being incurred.
Absolutely. No, and thank you for that clarification there, Simon. You've said it. I can't say it any better. I just want to add the caveat that any monetization of any of those assets, is a long-term undertaking. If you're going to pursue courts in Jamaica, pursue courts abroad, and so on, but we have a short-term funding issue, and that's why we have to step in. Now, it is entirely possible that even after the aggressive pursuit of those assets, that nothing turns up, but we have to be satisfied that the temporary manager aggressively goes after any assets on the balance sheet of SSL.
Understood. Dr. Clarke, there have been comments around previous investigations in Jamaica's history, and quite a few have stated that, we don't want this to be as long-tailed as, previous investigations. Is there any assurance that you can give on your side in any way that this won't be a 15, 20, 25-year matter?
What I can say, Simon, is that we're enabling the investigators. They have full unfettered access. Whatever resources they need, we'll provide. We're supporting them completely. So if there's ever a time that they should be able to wrap something up within a reasonable period of time, it is now. I think the fact that within a few months they had, an arrest, and they have said, if you read their statement clearly, they said they expect. I mean, if you I don't want anybody here to quote me. The FID. I'm just paraphrasing what the FID said. I am not the investigator, but the FID in their statement said they expect to have further arrests before the next court date. And by court date, I meant court date for Gina and Panton. The next court date for her is in December. So that's a relatively defined time period for them to expand the this to a stage where other people are brought before the court. I think this would be new, Simon, in Jamaica in relation to financial sector fraud, that within the year that the fraud was identified, let me use the word multiple people have been brought before the court. So that in itself, I believe, would set this case or this incident apart from previous incidents of this sort of complexion.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. Can you give us an idea of the total cost of the investigation thus far?
That's difficult for me to do. The costs. I mean, the cost of FID operations are their costs. You know, they have a budget, and you know this investigation is being um, undertaken within their normal operating budget. However, with respect to the engagement of Kroll Associates, uh, we are providing additional support. But I would have mentioned when I first mentioned Kroll that we are also getting the support of the government of the United Kingdom, who are, as they have done in the past in matters related to FID, they are providing support uh, for the engagement of Kroll in this matter.
The extent of their support is technical or monetary?
They're providing financial support.
Okay, thank you. Can you give us an idea of the size of that financial support?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but
Okay.
it's decent in the context of the cost of engaging Kroll Associates. I don't have it on me, and I need to also check what the any confidentiality clauses before I kind of divulge on that. But the we are being supported. This is not something that I'd said it before back in January, I believe. This is a matter in which we have received the financial support of the government of the United Kingdom through the UK High Commission here in Jamaica.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. Have management accounts been done for SSL, and are those accounts available, or will they be made available to the public?
I believe audited financial statements were produced for SSL for 2022. And indeed, a closing balance sheet was in the public domain earlier this year. In fact, a purported closing balance sheet was presented by the applicants for the winding up, and that would have been published. I think I even published that on my Twitter page at some point. With respect to the year 2023, which has not ended yet, I fully expect that, you know, to the extent that SSL is not wound up before then, that, you know, accounts will be, you know, prepared or are being prepared. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Dr. Clarke. Just looking through the rest of the comments, guys. Remember, we have about 15 minutes or so left. Remember to post your comments in the comment section. It's on the lower right hand corner of the space. Again, we want to thank everyone for joining us. It's been very informative. And remember, this is being recorded, so if needs be, you can listen to the recording for any additional clarification that you may need, or if you just came to the space, then you can re-listen. So someone just tagged me. So Dr. Clarke, how does the GOJ plan to restore confidence in the market while the investigation is ongoing and post SSL? Do you think that confidence has been lost?
This matter, as I think I used the expression before, is like a wrenching punch to the gut. Jamaica survived the global financial crisis. It survived two debt exchanges, let's call them local debt defaults. It survived the COVID-19 pandemic and the inflation crisis without a financial sector failure, thank God. And it took this to bring down a licensed security dealer, something that has not happened in quite a long time in Jamaica. So, of course, it has affected the Jamaican financial services sector, which is why the dogged pursuit of open, thorough, and complete investigation is so critically important and is in the public interest. And it is exactly for that reason, Simon, that presented with this Hobbesian choice, this difficult choice where legitimate interests collide, that the larger public interest of a full ventilation, complete and thorough investigation into this matter has to triumph. And in having that triumph, in ensuring that there is justice served in this matter, it is through that process that we restore faith and confidence in the financial system. Jamaicans will know that if these things happen, people will be brought to account.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. And a question coming from within our SOTR community. Some think that a precedent has been set where information is not being released in a timely manner. Can the government comment on whether there will be any standard touch base with the citizens of Jamaica and stakeholders around the SSL update in particular, or SSL updates or future SSL updates?
Well, the investigators will update when they have something to update. And in the absence of that, we will reiterate what the policy direction is. Last week, the investigators were in the country to provide part of their reason for being here. I mean, of course, they continued their work, but part of the thing, they provided me with an update, as I mentioned, which was very similar to the update provided by the FID to the country. And, what happens in Jamaica is what we call front running. And, the narrative that, this is be happening this week because of something that happened last week is a false narrative. The truth is that the Kroll investigators were here all of last week, and they would have met with me earlier in the week with the plan to provide the same update to me to the public. The idea was obviously to update me first, and then to update the public. And what we had was what some would call a little bit of front running. But we will, Simon, continue to update the public when, I hope that's not offensive to say, when there are developments. I will always be available to the public as a representative, as someone who has accountability for the stewardship of the Ministry of Finance portfolio. So I will always be available on this subject. But as far as investigators are concerned, they will come forward when there are new developments to come forward on. And
Thanks,
we
Doc.
expect there to be new developments, as they mentioned, certainly between now and the end of the year.
Thanks, Dr. Clarke. I guess a suggestion coming out of the community is if if there could be some form of landing page that could be created that consolidates the information around the investigation that has been released, so there is a single touch point. And I think the concern is coming from even clients of SSL that have been trying to get through to ask for these updates as to what's happening with your funds, how far along is the reconciliation, etc., who may not have been able to get through. So maybe a landing page to consolidate that information.
I think that's an excellent suggestion. That's an excellent suggestion. I'll discuss that with the triad of entities involved in this matter.
Thanks, Dr. Clark, and I'll follow up with you on that particular promise. Just seeing, I think we asked most of the pertinent questions. There, I'm just checking to see if there are any more. I guess the final question, but this was in the article around and you would have stated it at the top of the space around the amount of clients that have been affected. And you did state that that would have moved from about 40 plus clients to about 70 clients now, and that may change as the investigation deepens.
Yeah, correct. Correct.
So, Dr. Clark, I mean, is there anything else that you would like to share about this particular matter here in this space?
No, I just to wrap up and to say that I would hope that everyone can just recall and remember that the priority in this matter is to, at this stage, is to have a complete and thorough investigation into the alleged fraud at SSL. That is the priority. It's priority number one. And the policy of the government is going to be aligned with that priority. And that's a priority that we believe to be in the public's interest.
Thanks, Dr. Clark. And what I'll just continue to encourage you to do is to be available as you have been, to share information freely, and to be transparent as you have been. You've made yourself available through interviews, this space. In particular, and I will follow up with you on the commitment to create one consolidated space where the citizens can go and see information. So again, this is being recorded. I want to thank the 400 plus people that came out, the audience that have stayed for almost 1 hour. Listen, remember, this is recorded. You can go back and you can listen. You can share within your communities and share on social media. Dr. Clark, thank you again.
Thank you for hosting, Simon, and thank you for all who have joined on a busy Friday evening.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.